right, we'll go ahead and start today. There should be several more people joining us today, but they can just catch up as we go. So hey there, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar, Know Before You Go, Passing a Level 1 Inspection. Before we dive in, I did want to bring up the latest news for the trucking industry. As you've probably heard, the Supreme Court basically confirmed last week that the electronic logging device ELD mandate will take effect on December 18th, 2017. And that means everyone has about 6 months to get prepared, including, and that means everybody, including their brother, is soliciting ELDs. You've probably received their emails, and we just wanted to let you guys know that if you need help on navigating that minefield, our webinar next month will cover a wide range of information, such as selecting the right solution means planning ahead, system setup for success, compliance means changing daily workflow, the roadside ELD inspection, it's new for everyone, the personal conveyance pitfall, ELD out-of-service criteria, and much more. So we're going to be covering a lot of interesting topics next month with regards to ELDs. But also, if you want to do the research now, go to glowstone.com/geotab to find some more information. And you know, we've done the research for you guys, and that's what we came up with. Links will also be provided in the recap email after this webinar. But back to today's webinar topic, passing a Level 1 inspection. The North American Standard Level 1 inspection is the most thorough 37-step roadside inspection that includes an examination of both the driver operating requirements and vehicle mechanical fitness, such as brake systems, cargo securement, coupling devices, driveline and drive shafts, exhausts, frames, fuels, lighting, and much, much more. Since we don't have this year's data yet, last year's CVSA 2016 International Roadcheck found more than 1/5 of vehicles and 3.4% of drivers of Level 1 inspections were placed out of service due to critical item violations. And we have an ex-DOT inspector, Tony Hugo, that's going to be chatting with us about what one should do to pass a Level 1 inspection. Again, I'm Luke Kibbe. I'll be moderating the webinar today. Before we get started, just a couple things for housekeeping items. This webinar is interactive, so please submit your questions in the chat box. I'll keep an eye on them, and we'll have a Q&A session at the end to answer any questions. And if there's anything we miss, you know, there's going to be a recap email. Hopefully that goes out by the end of the day today or early tomorrow morning to answer any of those other questions. It's also going to be recorded, and so I'll provide that link in that email as well of the recorded webinar. With that, we can get started with a couple of poll questions. There should be 3 poll questions. Hopefully you can see them here. The 3 questions: did you receive a violation in your latest Level 1 inspection? Yes or no? If yes, what was the violation for? Was it hours of service related, vehicle maintenance related, or driver related? And the third one, did you provide training for the driver after they received a violation? So I'll wait just a couple minutes. I've seen a couple people already jumped in on that one. And I'm glad to see that so far it's all no's for no violations in your latest Level 1 inspection. I'm glad to see that. Hopefully this is just going to be a refresher course then for all the information of what a DOT inspector thinks about and looks at in regards to this presentation for you guys joining in on us. So thank you for filling that out and playing along. I'm excited to introduce Glowstone's Director of Safety, Tony Hugo. Welcome, Tony, and you should be ready to take it away.
Thank you, Luke, and good afternoon, everyone. Like Luke said, my name is Tony Hugo. I'm the Director of Safety Services with Glowstone Trucking Solutions. I've been with Glowstone for a little over a year. Prior to working with Glowstone, I worked for the Oregon Department of Transportation as the Safety Compliance Investigator, and I conducted roadside inspections and compliance reviews of motor carriers. Like Luke said, today's webinar is Level 1 DOT Inspections, entitled Know Before You Go, Passing a Level 1 Inspection. So let's first kind of talk about what is a Level 1 DOT inspection. And the Level 1 DOT inspection is going to be a complete, thorough inspection of both the driver and the vehicle, including the underside of the vehicle, measuring the brakes, checking suspension components, the frame, and the other parts that are visible from underneath the truck. This inspection will normally take about 40 to 50 minutes, depending upon what the inspector finds. And then there's also two other levels of inspection that you may encounter on roadside inspections or as you're traveling across the road. The common inspections, a Level 2 inspection, which is going to be an inspection of the driver and a walk around of the vehicle or vehicles, depending upon the combination. And the Level 2 inspection, vehicle portion of it, is very similar to a pre-trip inspection that a driver should be conducting at the beginning of their day. And then the other inspection is a Level 3. A Level 3 inspection is going to be just the driver inspection. DOT inspector will be checking the driver's CDL status, record of duty status, and supporting documents that go with their logbook, and the registration. Probably going to ask for the registration book and check for permits and different things like that during the inspection. And then you can expect both of the Level 2 and 3 inspections to last anywhere from 15 to 30 minutes, again, depending upon what they find and who the inspector is. I also want to take a few minutes to talk about a few different terms that I'm going to be referring to throughout the webinar. And if there's any that I miss or any that you'd like more information on, please let me know. Enter it into the chat box, and at the end of the webinar, I'll do my best to explain them in more detail. So the first part, a couple parts that I'm going to talk about are just to help you understand where I'm at in relation to the location of the vehicle, like a steer axle. Steer axle is obviously at the front of the truck or the power unit, and the steer axle is going to have some specific criteria that are a little bit different than other axles, though. For example, like the amount of tire tread depth. You have to have a little bit more depth, 4 32 of an inch on a steer axle, as opposed to any other axle. You only need 2 32 to be in compliance. And then after the steer axle, going to move back to the drive axles. And the drive axles are on the truck. The next set of axles on the truck is generally either a single axle or group of axles that provide power to move the truck down the road. And then the last group of axles or axles that I'm going to talk about are the trailer axles. And these are obviously on the trailer. Some trailers may have sliding axles, a tandem axle, group of axles that slide either forward or backward to help distribute the weight and adjust for weight to stay within the regulations of the maximum weight on a tandem axle. And then one quick note, if you're trying to adjust your weight by sliding the tandem axles, you want to slide the axles towards the overweight location. So as an example, if you're overweight at the rear of the trailer or on the trailer axles, then you're going to slide the tandem axles further to the rear so that you can adjust that weight, and it'll end up moving the weight further to the forward drive axles. So each time there's different notches on the tandem axle, and each notch is going to, if you slide it a specific notch, is going to move approximately 250 to 300 pounds to the other group of axles. Quite often, when I was doing inspections like out at Cascade Locks, there's Catskills and Troutdale, and at Cascade Locks, somebody, or when they're at Troutdale, they go to the Cascales, weigh their truck, find an overweight, say on the trailer axles, and then they slide the axles in the wrong direction, and that just increases the overweight. So then they would show up at Cascade Locks, and I would weigh them, and they would be overweight, more overweight than they were, and they couldn't figure it out, and that's because they're sliding the axles in the wrong direction. But there's a wide variety of different trucks and trailer combinations, as well as axle combinations and locations. But for the purposes of this webinar, we're mostly going to be talking about just a 5-axle truck and trailer that you see normally traveling on the highway. But all the different things that we talk about to inspect it on axles and wheels are going to just be the same thing. You're just going to have more axles or a different combination, so just be aware of that. There's also a couple specific parts that I want to mention in reference to the steering components, such as a pitman arm, which is a very easy part for the DOT to check, and if it's not in compliance with the regulations, meaning that there's any amount of play or looseness in the gears on the pitman arm, it's considered an out-of-service violation, and you're going to end up having to park until you get that fixed. Pitman arm is just something that DOT always pinpoints as being a very easy, like I say, very easy thing for them to check on. And then also in the air brake system, has some very specific parts that I'll be mentioning, like a brake chamber, push rods, automatic slack adjusters. The brake system, if it's not properly maintained, can easily lead to various minor violations, and then also lead to some more severe and serious out-of-service type violations. A couple things I want to cover in relation to the violations on an inspection report. If there are violations found and notated on an inspection report, and they're severe enough, then they're going to be considered an out-of-service violation. An out-of-service violation is predicated upon finding that a regulatory violation poses an imminent hazard to public safety. Drivers or vehicles are not to continue operating if the driver or vehicle was placed out of service for any reason. And then the consequences can be very severe if you do leave before the out-of-service situation has been rectified, or if the vehicle is driven before the out-of-service repairs are made. And there's sections 383.51 and 391.15 of the regulations outline the penalty structure for the drivers and the carriers who violate out-of-service orders, with actual disqualification periods and fine amounts being subject to the individual judge's discretion. In Oregon, jumping in out of service results in a citation for operating a commercial motor vehicle while the driver or vehicle is out of service. It comes with a mandatory court appearance and a fine of as much as $2,500, and also potential arrest. Again, when I was doing inspections at Cascade Locks, I had this exact incident happen. I put a driver out of service at the port of entry, which is east of Portland on Interstate 84. And the driver was placed out of service for being over the 14 and 11-hour rule at the time of inspection. The driver had been driving at the 18th hour, so well beyond the limit. And then after I completed the inspection and placed the driver out of service for 10 hours, he decided to drive off. State police was contacted and caught up to him about 20 miles down the road. And because he'd already jumped out of service once and the trooper couldn't stay there and wait for the entire out of service period, the trooper had called and told me that he arrested him and took him to jail for that. So nothing you want to be messing around with, I guess. You want to just stay for and get the repairs done, or stay for the amount of hours that you're put out of service if it's an hours violation. All other violations or non-out of service violations will need to be corrected before the next dispatch of the vehicle, so the driver will be able to continue the trip at that point. So now let's move into the actual inspection. As a DOT inspector, generally I was conducting a level 1 inspection at a port of entry like Cascade Locks, with a truck inspection bay, or sometimes at an outlying scale that wouldn't have a truck inspection bay. I preferred to do it where I had a bay because it has a pit that I can get underneath the truck and don't have to crawl around. or use a creeper to get underneath the truck. But you obviously may be stopped by a state trooper or a DOT inspector as you travel down the highway for the inspection. But while conducting a level 1 inspections, the entire process would start with selecting the vehicle. And there's several things that I was looking for, and many of I was trained by some of my coworkers, and many of them were doing the exact same thing. But the things that I was looking for when I was doing it was, if a truck's coming off the freeway and coming down the off-ramp towards the scale, I'm looking for an obvious violation, like a headlight out or cargo securement violation, or a dirty truck that doesn't look like it's very well kept. The thinking there is that if there's a headlight out and the driver either did a pre-trip inspection and missed that, then there's probably some other things that they may have missed, or didn't do a pre-trip inspection at all. And so what other things are going to be have violations associated with them? The other thing that I look at is the company's overall score. In Oregon, they look at the ISS, or Inspection Selection System, and the score ranges from 0 to 100, with 100 being the worst. If a company has a score of over 75, you're most likely going to get DOT attention and may be inspected just on that alone. I would also look at the company's driver and vehicle out of service rating in comparison to the national average. The national average out of service rating for drivers is 5%, and vehicles is 20% currently. So if the truck has a high ISS score, somewhere above 70, 75, and has close to or above the national average in either the driver or vehicle, or possibly both, there's a very good chance that vehicle is going to be inspected. I would almost guarantee that if I saw a truck come across a scale that had either one of those over national average and a high ISS, that truck, I would inspect that truck. And then the last way that I would choose trucks was kind of on a random method. I would generally go like between 5 and 10, pick a number between 5 and 10 for the day. Whatever that number is that I picked for the day, I would watch. If it was 7, I would watch the first 6 trucks go by. If nothing caught my eye on those first 6 trucks, then that 7th truck is going to be the one that I'm going to choose to inspect. So now that we've chosen a truck for an inspection, and then start the inspection off on the right foot, the driver needs to really pay attention to the signs at the scale and follow what they're telling you to do. The inspector, depending upon how busy the scale is, if it's not backed up at all, I would run out to the truck, talk to the driver real quick, give him a rundown of what I'm wanting him or her to do, and then give them instructions on going to the inspection bay and probably pull their logbook at that time too. Then so you're going to move your truck into the inspection bay. If you're pulling over a pit, the inspector should give you some direction on where to stay lined up with the pit, and then give you direction on when to stop your truck. At that point, I'm going to replace the wheel chocks and tell the driver to shut off the vehicle and make sure that all the brakes are released. The DOT officer is going to want all the brakes to be released, just like the driver's traveling down the freeway. No brakes set at all, and that's because they're going to want to inspect the brake system. I always started off and completed the inspection the same way, for me personally, so that I didn't miss anything, but also just to have a routine down so that I knew exactly what I was doing when I was going to do it. So at this point, I would move to the driver's side door and ask the driver to open up the door. A lot of times, I also had a question from the drivers, why do you want my door open? I did this for several reasons. One of the reasons is because I needed to get some information about the truck off the inside of the door, like the GVWR. There's certain mandatory entries in the report that I had to put in there. GVWR was one of them, and miles was another. So I'm asking for the door to be open so I can get the GVWR off the inside of the door. And then another reason is just for officer safety. The inspector doesn't know you, and they want to be comfortable with what you're doing inside the cab while they're inspecting the truck. So I want the door open when I'm standing near the driver, so I can just see their hands, see what's in the truck. Also, just kind of looking over the truck on the inside of the cab, getting an idea of where the fire extinguisher is at, if it's in the cab, and is it secure, which an unsecure fire extinguisher is a violation. And really, you want to make sure that nothing is rolling around on the floorboards that could get lodged behind the brake pedal or interfere with your driving at all. So you don't want anything rolling around on the floorboards. They'll also be collecting all the documents to complete the driver portion of the inspection at this time. So they're going to be asking the driver for their CDL or driver's license, logbook, bill of lading, any other supporting documents that go with the load, the registration book, and permits, and that sort of thing. After collecting all the information from the driver, I always just took it over and placed it on my desk, and then went to the front of the vehicle to start the vehicle portion of the inspection. At the front of the vehicle, I was looking at the windshield to check for any obstructions in the driver's line of sight, any cracks or chips intersecting. The cracks, are they intersecting? They, again, across the driver's line of sight. I'd also check to make sure that the windshield wipers were working properly. And in Oregon, it's pretty easy to do. You just, as the truck's coming into the inspection bay, just checking to make sure that there was the windshield wipers. Generally, they have a running when they're pulling in. And then I would ask the driver to turn on all the lights that the vehicle had. By turning on all the lights, the headlights should come on, and any of the ID lights and clearance lights. So I always do the same routine every time. I would ask the driver, when they turn on the headlights, generally they come on in low beam. I'd ask them to go to high beam, back down to low beam, left turn signal, right turn signal, and four-way flashers. And then again, at this time, I was checking to make sure that the 3 ID lights at the top of the cab and the clearance lights, one at each side of the ID lights near the outer portion of the top of the cab, are all lit up. And those are the minimum required lights at the front of the truck. A truck can have more lights than the minimum, but the lights that I just mentioned are have to be working and operable at the very minimum. There have been I've had some comments from drivers that ask a question about lights. If you have additional lights, there's some trucks that are, I'm sure you've noticed, that are kind of lit up like a Christmas tree traveling down the road. And if you have additional lights, is that a violation? And the answer to that is no, it's not a violation as long as you have the minimum number of lights working. So then the DOT officer may also ask you to sound your horn. At some point, I usually ask the driver to do it while I was in the front of the truck, and you're required to have a functioning horn, whether it's the big air horn or the city horn on the steering wheel. One of them has to work. You may pay attention to what the inspector asks you to do. They may say, please just sound your city horn, because inside of an inspection bay, you pull that big loud horn. It's a little bit loud. Once I finished with the lights at the front of the truck, I'd ask the driver to get out of the truck and open the hood so I could inspect the engine compartment. In the engine compartment, after giving it a quick look over for any obvious defects, I'd look at the pitman arm. And again, I mentioned earlier, the pitman arm is part of the steering components and an automatic out-of-service violation if there's any looseness or slack. And you can see it here on the on the screen. The 2 arrows are pointing. There's an inner gear. That's the arrow pointing near the center is showing the inner gear, and then where the second shorter arrow is pointing is where the gears kind of meet, and that's where you're looking for the loose or slackness, right where those 2 gears meet together. Another way, what I would usually do is we have a soapstone that we're using to mark different parts for the brake components. I would take the soapstone and draw a line straight down across the pitman arm there, that center round gear. And then you can watch the lines. They will sometimes separate, or you can see them move just a little bit. Another thing to look for on if you're checking your own truck is a loose pitman arm. There will be some rust that'll develop, and then the rust will you'll see a rust line coming out of that, and that's a good indication that any type of bolt or something is not tight. So check for that rust mark. In order to check the pitman arm, the inspector is going to ask the driver to rock the steering wheel back and forth pretty hard, pretty rigorously. And again, they're just watching to see if there's any play or movement inside that area. Inside the engine compartment, I would also inspect the brakes on this wheel and mark the push rod as close to the brake chamber as I could. So here we have a picture of a brake chamber. On the left side, there's two different brake chambers that are side by side, and the one that on the furthest to the left has the blue plastic on the rod that's coming out of the top of it. That's the push rod. And the black portion, where the gold rod is coming out of it, is where I would mark down as close to that black portion as possible. So as the brakes are pushed, that push rod actually is going to extend further out of the brake chamber, and then it's going to push the chalk line further away from it, and I measure where the chalk line is back to the location that I originally marked, and to figure out the travel distance on that. Then I'd take a quick look at the suspension, check and make sure that nothing is broken, worn, and that everything is tight and secure. During a pre-trip inspection, if your truck looks like it's leaning to one side or the other, there's a good possibility that there's something wrong with the suspension components. Again, that's something that we looked at when I was with DOT as the trucks were coming off the freeway. If a truck was, it'll be a substantial amount of lean if you have a broken suspension, and you could see trucks come in and they're leaning heavy to one side. There's a good chance that there's a problem with the suspension, and you're going to most likely get inspected at that point. At each wheel, I also check the wheel for cracks and loose or missing lug nuts. DOT refers to lug nuts as wheel fasteners on the inspection report, just so you know. After I'm done with the front driver's side wheel inspection, I move to the driver's side saddle area, which is the area between the steer axle and the next group of axles on the truck, the drive axles. And there I'm just checking for the steps for the driver to enter the vehicle, mirrors, and fuel tank, making sure everything is securely mounted and nothing is falling off the truck, especially the fuel tank. And the fuel tank needs to be properly mounted, not held on by a tie down. I've seen this in the past where I was inspecting a vehicle. I didn't notice it up on the top side because the fairing or the body pieces were covering up the fuel tank, but as I got underneath the truck and inspected it, I found out that the fuel tank was actually just held on by cargo straps that you would normally see holding on cargo on a flatbed trailer. So it's obviously a very dangerous situation, and the truck was placed out of service until repairs could be made to properly secure the fuel tank. Another couple of items in relation to the fuel tank. You need to make sure the fuel tank has a proper cap on it. I've also seen in the past where somebody just stuck a rag in the fuel filling area. It's not considered a proper fuel tank in the DOT's eyes. And then also make sure that the cap is there. Sometimes people lay the cap down on the deck or something, or on the fuel tank itself when they're fueling it, forget to put it back on, and the cap falls off. Truck shows up at the scales and it doesn't have a cap on it, and the diesel fuel's been sloshing around and spilling, and then now you have a drip coming off of the tank. That's another easy thing to check is a leaking fuel tank. During the course of the inspection, the DOT officer, if they find a pool of liquid of any sort, they're going to investigate it, figure out where it's coming from, and generally write up a violation. Could potentially lead to an out-of-service violation if it's a substantial amount leaking. And then that includes any fuel tank including the reefer trailer or auxiliary power unit tank if it's got one. And then I would also check the area between the truck and the trailer. A few of the more important areas here are the exhaust system, if it's visible, and the air and electric lines connecting the vehicles, and the deck area of the truck. So in the picture to the left here, the DOT officer standing by the trailer, and right in front of him, that flat area there is the deck, and you can see those lines hanging down between the truck and the trailer. You don't want those lines, the air lines or the electric line, to be sagging so much that it's making contact with that deck area. That's where the deck, if it's laying on the deck area, it's going to rub and eventually wear a hole in the lines, and then that hole is going to create an air leak and could result in the brake system not functioning properly and potentially failing. So that's a pretty serious violation that, again, is extremely easy for a driver to find and also for DOT to find, and they're looking for that as the truck's going across the scales. It's one of the big things that they cue on is when the truck gets close to them, they check the lines, making sure that nothing is laying on the deck or rubbing the lines. Next group of axles is going to be the drive axles. And I would again check the tires for tread, lug nuts, any cracks or defects on the wheels. There's several other things that you need to be checking in the tire. In addition to the amount of tread depth, obviously you want to make sure the tire is not low or flat. DOT will consider a flat tire if it's got less than 50% of the recommended maximum air pressure. And then you can locate the recommended air pressure on the sidewall of the tire. Generally, a single semi-truck tire is going to have a sidewall recommended pressure of 100 to 110 psi. And super singles can be upwards of around 125 psi. On the screen, we've got a couple different violations for what's going to create an out-of-service violation for like wheel fasteners. There's the 10 lug. If there's three are missing anywhere or 2 adjacent lugs are missing, it's going to be an out-of-service. And then for an 8 lug or less, then 2 missing anywhere could be an out-of-service violation. And there's a couple other different violations and results up on the screen. So what you're going to want to do is figure out what a sidewall says. Back to the tire pressure, I apologize. What you're going to want to do is figure out what the sidewall says and make sure you have at least 50% of that rating. So obviously 110 pounds, you have to have at least 55 pounds of pressure in that tire. If it's less than that, it's going to be considered flat and the truck will be placed out of service. Another area you're going to want to pay attention to is the sidewall of the tire, and check to make sure that there are not any cuts or bulges on the sidewall of the tire. And a lot of times, or rarely did I find bulges or cuts on the sidewall of the tire on the outside of the truck where the driver can easily see it, but I did find quite often on the inside of the tire or in between if you have dual wheels. In between the wheels is where you're going to find where the DOT officer is going to find a lot of bulges or cuts in the tire or something. The driver goes over a curb or something and it hits in between the tires and it can damage that sidewall, and that's what's going to create the bulge in the tire. In addition to looking at the tires and wheels on the drive axle, I was also looking at the coupling device here. On a traditional 5-axle on a traditional 5th wheel assembly, there are several components that need to be checked. Mainly what the DOT inspector is going to be checking for on a 5th wheel assembly is that all the components are secure and there are not any cracks or damaged parts. Also checking the bolts on the 5th wheel assembly. And the best way to check bolts for tightness is to try turning. Just put your hand on it and try to turn them. Occasionally you find one loose. They all obviously need to be tightened down and secure. During an inspection one time I was checking the bolts and grabbed a hold of one and it was completely loose, and I was actually able to lift it completely out of the hole. And the bolt somehow got sheared off, or it was just somebody had just placed one in the hole to make it look like there was one there. That's kind of what I figured happened, but there was just a bolt sitting in the hole. DOT is going to verify that there's none missing, and a quick way that they do that to check is count the bolts on one side and then count them on the other side. And if there's 6 on the right side, there needs to be 6 on the left side. And then again, another way to check and see if they're loose is to check for rust, where the officer's fingers are at pointing at that bolt there. If that one was loose, after some time, there's going to be some rust created, and there'll be a little drip or a rust stain drip line coming down from that bolt. DOT may also check taillights and turn signals at the back of the truck, even though it's hooked up to a trailer at this time. It's not out of service if they're out, but it would be a violation, and they're checking these in case you drop your trailer and you bobtail somewhere. They're making sure that all the lights are working properly, and those are required operational lights that would be out of service if the truck was not hooked up, but it would just be a violation if it was hooked to a trailer. And then as I make my way back to the trailer axles, or axle if it has a single, I would be checking the structural integrity of the trailer at this point, looking for any damage at the front, top sides, or deck of the trailer. This is also, if it's a refrigerated trailer, where the fuel tank for the refrigeration unit will usually be located. Again, I'd make sure that the fuel tank is properly secured, the fuel cap is securely in place, and there's no leaks from the tank. If it's a flatbed, I'm checking to make sure that the securement devices are all properly used, secure, and the right amount of devices for the size and type of cargo. If it's a piece of machinery, is it secure with the right type of chain, and does it contain enough working load limit in accordance with the regulations? And if it's if they're nylon straps, are there enough of them? Are they in good condition? No significant holes or tears, and properly tightened. If the load is not blocked or braced by a headboard, is there another strap on the front row to make up for the headboard not being there? And then there's very specific commodity requirements in regards to load securement. For example, if it's finished lumber and it's more than 2 tiers high, you have to have gut wraps, what they call gut wraps, in between on the second tier. And then if it goes to the 4th tier and it's more than 4 tiers, you have to have another set of gut wraps so every second tier you have to have gut wraps on. And then you would need straps going over the entire load itself too. After checking the side of the trailer, I would then move to the trailer axles. At the trailer axles, I'd be checking everything that I've checked on all the other locations. And if it's a sliding tandem axle, to adjust the weight distribution, sliding tandem axles have locking pins and slide rails. I'm going to be looking at the number of locking pins. Normally there's 4, 2 on each side. And it's very easy to check these locking pins to make sure they're engaged. If they're not engaged, or if one of them's not working, that's going to be a violation that is extremely easy to avoid if you do a good, proper pre-trip inspection. And then not having any locking pins engaged will allow the axles to slide freely. I've heard stories, I haven't seen it myself, but I've heard stories about the locking pins not being fully engaged and failing when the driver had to brake hard. The entire axle assembly has been completely ripped out from underneath the trailer. Another area that should be checked is the reflective tape down the side of the trailer and on the back of the trailer. Each side of the trailer should have reflective tape equally spaced on at least half the length of the trailer. And then on the back, you have to have it going across your bumper and the lower portion. You can kind of see it on the lower picture. That lower bumper piece has the reflective tape there. And then there's the reflective tape just above the deck area too. So at the back of the trailer, I would again have the driver turn on all the lights, checking to make sure the trailer had the 3 ID lights and 2 clearance lights in addition to the tail lights. And then I'd have the driver turn on left turn, right turn, brake lights, and 4-way flashers. And then one additional light on the back of a trailer. Near the back of a trailer is the anti-lock braking system, or ABS light. And it's near the bottom of the trailer on the left side, a few feet in from the back. It's usually a small, round, amber light. And if the DOT officer is checking this ABS light, they're going to ask the driver to turn the key to the off position and turn the key back to the on position. And what that's going to do is cycle the diagnostics of the truck. And if the ABS light is working, or ABS system is working properly, the light should come on for a few seconds and then shut back off. If the light does not come on, or the light doesn't turn back off, it comes on and stays solid, then there's a problem with the ABS system somewhere. On the right side of the vehicle, the DOT officer is going to check everything back towards the front of the truck as they did on the left coming to the back of the truck, with one additional piece. Generally on the right side of the vehicle is where the spare tire holder's at. And you'll also potentially find tire chains hanging here. I had a state trooper one time tell me that he didn't really care too much about the spare tire rack, the spare tire in the rack. The picture on the right here shows it kind of at a little bit of an angle, and he felt that the gravity would just normally hold that into place. It needs to be secured by a chain or some sort of tie down, but he never wrote that up, and that is again another out of service violation. He never worried too much about it until one time he was responding to a accident where a tire had come off of a trailer, bounced down the road, hit a car, and actually ended up killing an 11-year-old girl in the car. And from that point forward, he wrote a citation and a violation on the inspection report and placed the truck out of service every time. And after I heard that story, it stuck with me. Every time I saw a spare tire rack, I would go and double check to make sure that it had a chain hanging or holding it in place. So now that I've came back to the front of the vehicle, finished the walk around of the vehicle, I would then return to the driver and talk to him or her about what I'm going to do when I'm underneath the truck, checking the brakes and the underside of the truck and trailer. I would also verify that the brakes are released like the driver's traveling down the road, and that the air pressure is between 90 and 100 psi. They want that air pressure to be between 90 and 100 psi, and it's actually part of the inspection process that it needs to be at that level so that the brake system is working properly when they measure the brake travel. The DOT officer is also going to make sure that the driver understands not to do anything unless told to do so. This includes pushing the brakes, setting the brakes, and especially starting the truck. I've been underneath the truck when the driver either bumps the brake pedal or had a couple times where they decided they wanted to start up the truck. I don't know if they were cold or what the deal was, but it's not a very comfortable feeling to be underneath of a truck and have it all of a sudden start up, or have your hands, like this officer's got his hands in some of the working components of the underside of the vehicle, and they push their brakes, and the potential injury could be smashed fingers, or something could happen to the officer. During this portion of the inspection, I would always enter the truck from the front, and when I got to the front axle or the steer axle, I'd ask the driver again to rock the steering wheel back and forth pretty rigorously so I could inspect all the steering components. And at the steering axle, I'd also be checking the suspension, brake components, and finally mark all the brakes if I hadn't done so when I was checking the engine compartment. Another couple items that could be checked while the driver is conducting a pre-trip inspection is the exhaust system and any oil or leaks coming from the engine. Moving back to the drive axles, again checking the suspension, frame, and brake components. One particular item that I would really pay attention to in all the brakes is the friction surface of the brakes, where the brake pad meets the brake rotor or drum. The surface should be smooth and not contaminated by any fluids. Again, very common violation and easy for the DOT officer or a driver to check on their pre-trip inspection is any grease or oils leaking from the axle hub. That grease or oil is eventually going to make its way down to or onto the friction surface of the brake and create a brake violation and potential out of service. After checking and marking the brakes at the drive axles, I would then work my way back to the trailer tandems, again checking the tires, suspension, frame and brakes, and then marking all the brakes. Then at that point, after I've marked all the brakes, I'm at the very rear of the trailer, underneath the drive axles or just behind underneath the trailer axles or just behind the trailer axles. I would yell for the driver to push and hold the brakes. So now what the DOT officer wants is for them to give a full brake application, push the brake pedal as hard as they can down to the floor and hold the brake at that point. So then on my way back to the front of the truck, I'm measuring the distance of travel, like I said here on that picture with the where he's circling there on the right side, right upper photo. That's the brake push rod coming out of the brake chamber, and they're measuring the distance that it travels. So on a steer axle, generally they're going to have a Type 20 brake chamber. A Type 20 brake chamber is allowed 1 3/4 inches of travel before it becomes a violation. All the other brake chambers on your drive axles or trailer axles are going to generally be a Type 30 brake chamber, and that gives you 2 inches of travel. On the picture to the left here, if you see the holes on the one that has the blue, there's holes that are round, and the one to the on the right side, they're square holes. That designates a long stroke with square holes compared to a regular stroke, which is a round hole. The long stroke is going to give you a little bit more travel on your push rod before you're in violation. And that's where as your brake pads start to wear, the push rod is going to end up traveling a little bit further each time as the brake pad gets a little bit thinner and thinner. It takes a longer travel distance for it to make full contact with the brakes and apply the brakes fully. So that's where these automatic slack adjusters come in. If working properly, an automatic slack adjuster, which automatic slack adjusters are required on any vehicle manufactured after October 20th, 1994. So the majority of trucks have automatic slack adjusters on them. The automatic slack adjuster should adjust the amount of travel needed to apply the brakes completely as the brakes wear out. So if your brakes are out of adjustment, generally you're also going to get a violation for the slack adjuster not working properly to accommodate for the wear of the brakes. So again, you just need to verify, you'll want to make sure that you verify the size and type of brake chamber that's on your vehicle. Once the measurements of the brake is complete, the driver will be told to release the brakes. Almost all the items that I mentioned checking while under the truck can be checked while the driver is conducting a pre-trip inspection without having to crawl underneath the truck, aside from measuring your brakes. But you can pretty much get an idea of like the brake pads and the wear and how much or any fluids that might be leaking out onto the brake pad surface itself during a pre-trip inspection. Going under the truck just makes it easier to do the inspection, but the suspension, frame, brakes, exhaust system, can all be seen and inspected while they're doing their daily walk around. Drivers just need to be educated on what they're looking for and what DOT is looking for when they're going to write up a violation. After completing the inspection of the vehicle, there's a few items the DOT officer is going to check. First, they're going to probably want to check if they didn't see it during the inspection. They're going to want to check the fire extinguisher and triangles if and they're going to verify you need to have at least 3 triangles, and also be checking the gauge on your fire extinguisher to make sure that it's in the green and that it's properly charged and ready to be used. The next couple things they're going to do during the inspection process, they may do a few tests on the vehicle. They're going to check things like the low air warning test indicator, air loss test rate. They may do that test, and then also check the tractor protection valve system. I only did an air loss test rate, check the air loss rate if I found substantial air leaks during the inspection. Otherwise, there's no point if the truck's not losing air. And then once all the tests are complete, I would type up the report, provide a copy for the driver, and review it, informing the driver of everything that will need to be done before they leave the inspection site if there were any out-of-service violations, and what the driver will need to do if there are violations but they're not out-of-service violations. Some of the easiest things to catch during a pre-trip inspection are also some of the most common violations written up on a roadside inspection. There are 3 areas that most of the violations come from, and those are the lights, tires, and brakes. And I also recently read a story or an article about 63% of roadside inspections are triggered by a commercial motor vehicle being driven with an observable defect, such as inoperable required lights, underinflated tires or flat tires, missing hazardous material placards, cargo securement issues, or fluids leaking. This is also, like I said earlier, kind of been my experiences. I don't have any actual facts or stats on what my experiences were, but I would select a vehicle with a visual defect over any other way of selecting a truck for an inspection. And then the article went on to say that another 22% of roadside inspections are triggered by a suspected moving violation such as speeding, following too close, failure to obey a traffic control device, or driving in a restricted lane or something along those lines. And then these are all controllable behaviors on the part of the driver and inspections that could be avoided if the driver doesn't bring this attention to their vehicle. So that's as much as 85% of vehicles chosen for inspections are due to visible violations, which I'm sure many of them could have been corrected before the DOT found them, or how the vehicle was being operated. So if the vast majority of roadside inspections are triggered by driver behavior in one form or another, or poor or inadequate pre-trip inspections, or violating traffic laws, then I think knowledge is power. Through a quality, consistent training, educating your drivers in target avoidance techniques, conducting proper and thorough vehicle inspections that eliminate observed defects before hitting the road, driving defensively, and obeying all traffic laws, drivers can avoid putting themselves at greater risk of accidents and also being part of DOT or targeted by the DOT for inspection. So after the inspection has been completed and there's no violations or defects found, on a level 1 inspection, you'll be free to go and most likely receive a CVSA decal that should be placed on the windshield of the truck if the vehicle passes, like say, the level 1 inspection. Vehicles displaying a valid CVSA decal are generally not subject to reinspection unless they find there's a observable defect or DOT sees a headlight out as you're coming down to the scale, and then the decal is valid for up to 3 months. The inspection report must be given to your employer, And some agencies, depending upon who's doing the inspection, require a copy of the inspection report to be signed and returned to that agency. Oregon only requires a copy to be returned to the DOT if there are violations noted. If there aren't any violations, they're going to tell you don't worry about mailing it back to them. If one or more violations or defects that don't require your vehicle to be placed out of service are found, they'll again be allowed to continue. Violations other than out of service violations detected during inspections will not preclude completion of the trip. They just need to be corrected within 15 days or prior to your redispatch of the affected vehicle. If one or more violations or defects are found to be unsafe, so unsafe that they must be corrected before operation can resume, the driver and or vehicle will be placed out of service. The inspector will indicate what needs to be done before you can drive again. One thing I also want to mention in relation to the violations or citations, another misconception is when citations affect the company's CSA score. The only time a citation is going to affect the CSA score, for example, like a speeding ticket, will be when the DOT or whoever's issuing that citation also does an inspection and notes that on the inspection report itself that there was a citation, and then they put in whatever the speeding ticket or whatever that was. That's the only way that it gets reported to the FMCSA or CSA to affect your scores. If the driver receives a citation but is not inspected and there's no notation on an inspection report of the citation or the ticket, then it will not affect your CSA scores at all. So that pretty much wraps it up. You should be prepared for a roadside inspection now, or at any time as you're traveling down the road. And then also how you conduct yourself can make a difference in how constructive and positive the roadside inspection experience turns out to be. You should respond in professional, courteous manner when asked to participate in a roadside inspection, and maintain this throughout the entire process. By doing this, it'll eliminate the possibility of you negatively affecting the outcome of the inspection. And I mean, inspectors are human. If you treat them negatively, then it's probably going to have some sort of an effect on the outcome of the inspection. So I want to thank you all for listening, and I'm going to turn it back over to Luke now for any questions and to follow up on any comments in the chat box. Thank you very much.
Awesome, and thank you again, Tony, for the presentation today. There's lots of great information here. Before we wrap up, I do know that it's top of the hour, 2 o'clock, but if you guys are willing to stick around, feel free to type in a couple of questions, and I can pass them on to Tony. Otherwise, feel free to email me or Tony himself if there's any questions. So I'll give you guys a couple minutes or about a minute to type in a question. I know at the beginning of the presentation, Tony, one person mentioned that they run dump trucks, and a lot of times they get pulled over. They claim that the rear license plate requires a light, even though the manufacturer does not put one on the rear of the truck, and then they usually do a level 1 or level 2 inspection on the trucks. Did you ever come across that kind of situation?
Sorry about that. So for that, I've had a couple questions on that in the past about the license plate light on the back of a truck. I understand what you're saying, because generally the license plate is mounted on the dump portion of the truck, and you can't have a line going to that light. The regulations or the state laws state that you will have a light on a license plate at the rear of your vehicle, and so it's kind of a catch-22 there. It's tough to put one on there without ripping the plate off or having an issue. But it is required by law that you have a light that lights up your plate. I personally never wrote that up. What you're running into is somebody that is following the letter of the law, and maybe not understanding reality of having a license plate light on your truck. So yes, it's one of those areas where it's a little, I don't want to say a gray area, but the officer is correct. You are required to have one, but is it reality that you're going to be able to keep one there? To me, I think you are correct in that last statement that they're using it as a reason to complete a level 1 or 2 inspection. They're also going to use it as a reason. A police officer has to have probable cause to pull over a vehicle. They're going to use that as their reason to pull you over and make contact with you and get the vehicle stopped. I believe that's probably what they're doing, especially if it's like Clackamas County, the sheriff's deputies, or their motor vehicle enforcement department, that they're just using a license plate light to get the truck stopped and make contact with you so that they can initiate the level 1 or 2 inspection. I know that doesn't help you a lot because it doesn't really help you get out of this. So you say, my trucks are 2016 and 2018. Is there any way to prevent this? I don't know a way to prevent that. I've looked at a couple different dump trucks. And other than mounting the license plate at the lowest point possible, but then you're going to be below the dump area and you're going to run into a problem there. I've seen dump trucks that have the license plate mounted in the center, underneath, like just above the pintle hook, where it's going to hook to where the trailer is going to hook to if you're running a dump truck and a pup. I've seen license plates mounted just above the coupling device there, but I can't tell you if there was a light attached to it or not at that point. License plate lights were not one of my big things that I really pursued because I wasn't a enforcement officer like a police officer. I was an inspector, and to me that wasn't a huge thing. There were bigger issues. I was more worried about the safety of the vehicle traveling down the road, and the license plate light is more of so they can read the license plate at nighttime. So again, I apologize if that's not extremely helpful to you, but it's just kind of the way that I did things.
Awesome. It doesn't look like there's any other questions that I see, so I'll just go ahead and wrap this up. There's a couple more things that I wanted to touch on, but before so, I just wanted to say again, thank you, Tony. Your experience is awesome for us to be able to learn from you and your perspective, previous perspective. So thank you, Tony. Moving on, luckily the attendees today mentioned that they did not have any violations when they were having their level 1 inspections, but if you did, a lot of times the DOT intervenes as they intervene to correct a safety problem. They usually will require a detailed response in writing, a corrective action plan that you're going to be taking. Sometimes you heard it as a CAP plan. We provide a service to help you build that plan, provide the timely correspondence necessary to comply with the requirements. Usually there's I believe a 60-day window. However, sometimes they take like 45 days to complete the process on their end. So you really only have a 15-day window to provide some information, and we've helped clients save quite a bit of money on the various violations through their CAT plan process and walking through that. But if you want to find out more information, visit us. Our solutions page at glowstone.com. There's under safety services. There's audit services there that you can check that out for more information. Like I said, I'll also provide the links to all of this in the slides in the email. Finally, or two more things. EOPs, big things going on right now. Like I mentioned at the beginning, the Supreme Court failed or did not want to listen to the arguments and basically saying there's nothing else getting in the way for ELDs to be good to go. It's going to happen December 17th, and if you want to find out more information, we've done the research for you. You can go to glowstone.com/geotab to see what we've come up with. And finally, like I mentioned, it leads into our webinar next month. It's going to be July 18th. So I've updated the webinar where you can sign on portion for this webinar. It's a special webinar, Navigating the ELD Technology Minefield, and we're going to be covering 6 various topics here in some good detail. So it's a good one to join in. Feel free to register. You can go register today now, and like I mentioned, we'll provide the slides for you. With that, we're done with this webinar. Thank you for attending, and we hope to see you next month, and have a great rest of your day.